Better to conquer yourself than to win 1,000 battles against others. Buddha. They came to him not because he promised answers, but because he didn't lie. Not about pain, not about darkness, not about the price of waking up. That morning, one man sat across from Buddha. His body was quiet, but inside, chaos. The kind of chaos that creeps in slowly, softly, until it becomes your new normal. He spoke carefully, like someone walking across thin ice. "I've let go of everything," he said. "Desires, expectations, control, but my life is falling apart. Nothing holds anymore." Buddha didn't answer immediately. He looked at the man like someone looks at a tree that's been bent by years of wind. And then he said, "When you abandon control without understanding its nature, you don't reach peace. You invite collapse." The man blinked. "People confuse surrender with passivity," Buddha continued, "but there is a difference between letting go of illusions and letting go of responsibility. One leads to clarity, the other to slow self-destruction." The man lowered his gaze. There was shame behind his silence. That silent belief that he had failed again, even in trying to be free. Buddha saw it, and he didn't flinch. "You didn't fail," he said. "You just weren't told the whole truth. We are taught that freedom means the absence of control, that the less we hold, the more we live. But what no one says is that a life without any control is not freedom. It is drifting. It is erosion. It is waking up one day and not recognizing your own reflection." "Do you think the river is free?" Buddha asked. "Only because it flows?" The man looked up. "It is free because it knows where it goes." And this is the truth most people never hear. Control is not the enemy. It is the anchor, not control over others, not rigid control over feelings, but inner control, the kind that keeps you aligned when life tries to scatter you into pieces. Most people lose their lives not because they choose chaos, but because they think it is more honest than structure, because they were told that control is a prison, but it's not. Control without awareness is a cage. Control with awareness is freedom. Without it, the shadow takes over. The unconscious drives. Old pain starts calling the shots, and you begin to sabotage everything good before it even begins. Not because you want to, but because no one's holding the wheel. The man asked, "Then how do I take back the wheel?" And Buddha replied, "First, you admit that you dropped it, not because you're weak, but because you were tired of holding what wasn't yours. Now you must learn what is yours and hold that fully." And that's where healing begins, not in release, but in responsibility. In the quiet, something shifted in the man's face. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of strength. If these words speak to something inside you, subscribe to this channel so more people can hear the truth they've been avoiding for years. And don't forget to join the Telegram. That's where we go deeper. The next morning, the man returned. His eyes carried less panic, but more questions. Buddha didn't speak at first. He simply motioned for the man to sit. And when the silence had settled like dust on stone, he began. "Many who seek peace," Buddha said, "end up escaping themselves. They call it surrender. They call it flow. But often, it's fear in disguise." The man nodded slowly. He had heard it before. Let go, release, stop controlling. But no one ever told him what to do after that. Letting go was easy. What followed was emptiness. And no one teaches you how to hold emptiness without collapsing into it. Buddha leaned forward. "Do you know what happens when you abandon the helm of a ship in a storm?" "It sinks," the man whispered. "No," Buddha replied. "Not always. Sometimes it just spins. And it keeps spinning until everyone on board forgets there ever was a direction. And then they call that chaos life." That's what happens when you give up control without replacing it with responsibility. You stop steering, but the storm doesn't stop blowing. And then your life becomes a reaction to pain instead of a movement toward truth. People think surrender means being okay with everything, Buddha continued. But some things you must not be okay with. Some boundaries you must protect. Some choices you must make, even when they terrify you. The man listened closely now. You can't heal by stepping aside, Buddha said. You heal by stepping into your fear, into your patterns, into the responsibility of shaping your life, not waiting for it to shape you. Most suffering isn't rooted in what happens to us. It's in the stories we tell ourselves after we give up the wheel. The stories that whisper, "This is just how I am. This is just my fate. Nothing will change." And so we shrink. Not because life demands it, but because we've mistaken survival for wisdom. Buddha looked at the man. What you thought was freedom was surrender to confusion. You stopped controlling because you believed it was wrong. But what you needed was to learn how to control, not whether. Real control is not about resisting every impulse or suppressing every feeling. It's about knowing which ones serve your path and which ones lead to self-abandonment. It's not about perfection. It's about alignment with your values, with your truth, with who you are when no one is watching. And the hardest part? It's not learning how to control. It's unlearning what control was taught to mean. It was never about shame, never about rigidity. True control is the most compassionate act of all, because it says, I care enough about my life to hold it steady when everything tries to pull me away from myself. They walked together in silence. The sun was rising, soft and indifferent. Buddha stopped by a tree and pointed to its roots. If a tree grows without roots, he said, the first storm will break it. But if it only grows roots and never reaches upward, it dies without ever seeing the sky. The man stood still, listening. Balance, Buddha said. That's what control really is. And to understand it, you must first understand your body. People often speak of the mind and the soul, forgetting the flesh that holds both. Your body is the first place where control is either lost or found. Most people don't notice when they grip their jaw, when their stomach tightens, when their hands curl in anxiety. They've trained themselves to ignore these signs, convinced that control means pushing through discomfort. But in truth, the body never lies. When you suppress emotion, it settles into your muscles. When you avoid fear, it echoes in your breath. When you pretend to be calm, your heartbeat betrays you. And this is where chaos begins, not in thought, but in the nervous system. Buddha sat, resting his palm on the earth. You must learn to feel your body without letting it command you, he said. Most people swing between two extremes, either ignoring what they feel or becoming slaves to it. Real control begins when you can witness the urge to run, to lash out, to freeze, and choose not to obey it blindly. It doesn't mean denying pain. It means being able to hold pain without becoming it. Like a strong container, like a riverbank. It allows the water to flow, but doesn't let it flood the land. The man asked, "How do I know when I've lost that balance?" Buddha answered, "When you start making choices only to avoid discomfort. When your decisions are shaped more by fear than by truth. When you confuse reaction with action." The modern world confuses tension with strength. But strength is not how hard you clench your fists. It's how still you can remain when your whole body screams for escape. That's the difference between resistance and awareness. Resistance blocks. Awareness contains. And awareness is what creates the space for control to live. Without that space, You're just acting out unconscious programs, inherited patterns, unresolved wounds, old scripts. And no matter how free you think you are, if you're not in your body, you're not present. And if you're not present, you're not in control. Buddha closed his eyes. To master control, you must first learn stillness. Not stillness of movement, but stillness of intention. Of being able to say, I see this impulse, I feel this fear, and I choose differently. That is the beginning of power. The man lowered his head, not in shame, but in respect. For the first time, he understood that control wasn't a prison. It was a discipline of love. That evening, Buddha brought the man to a nearby village. They sat at a distance, watching people move through their day. A woman yelling at her child in exhaustion. A man stumbling out of a tavern. A merchant shouting prices with forced cheer. Look closely, Buddha said. This is what happens when life is not guided, when the wheel turns, but no one holds it. The man watched silently. Every face showed some kind of fight, either too much control, rigid and brittle, or too little, lost and collapsed. Without awareness, Buddha continued, people are either tightening their grip out of fear or letting go completely out of despair, but both are reactions, not choices. They moved closer to the center of the village. There, sitting alone by a fountain, was a man who looked far older than his age. His clothes were unwashed, his eyes distant. Years ago, Buddha said, he believed that structure was a prison. He gave up everything: work, routine, responsibility. He said he was seeking freedom. The man looked at Buddha, uneasy. And did he find it? Buddha shook his head. He found emptiness. Not the sacred kind, the hollow kind. The kind that comes when you remove the frame but forget the purpose. This is the silent fate of many. Not dramatic collapse, not chaos with flames, just slow erosion. The kind that eats away at meaning one day at a time. No direction, no structure, no fire, just existing, floating, waiting for something to change without realizing that nothing changes until you take the reins. Buddha pointed again. Look at his hands, always shaking, not from illness, but from years of never holding anything firm. No task, no mission, no accountability. His soul grew tired of drifting. The man said, but isn't that what the world teaches? To follow feelings, to let go, to be in the moment. Buddha's eyes were calm. Yes, but without a center, moments swallow you. Without a spine, softness becomes collapse. And without direction, freedom becomes suffering. There is no peace in surrendering to nothingness. There is no healing in abandoning form. People think they're escaping control, but they're really escaping themselves. Their fear of failure, of shame, of responsibility. And that fear grows in the absence of purpose. When you don't guide your life, life doesn't stay still. It decays, slowly, quietly, until one day you realize the pain you tried to avoid was the very pain you needed to confront. The man sat in silence, watching the village dissolve into dusk. Buddha said, "You were not born to drift. You were born to steer, not with force, but with presence. Because a life without conscious control isn't peace. It's absence. It's letting wounds run the show. It's letting the shadow write your story, and eventually it writes an ending that feels inevitable, but it never was." The next day, they walked into the hills. Buddha said little, letting the silence stretch like thread between thoughts. Then he stopped, picked up a smooth stone from the ground, and held it out. "This," he said, "is the self people try to become. Polished, untouched, controlled. But do you know how a stone becomes smooth?" The man replied, "By being tossed by the river. Buddha nodded. Exactly. Not by hiding from life, but by meeting it again and again with awareness. Real control doesn't come from avoidance. It comes from contact, from standing in front of the fire without letting it consume you. People think controlling themselves means perfection, emotionlessness, never breaking. But that's not control. That's fear, wrapped in discipline. And fear will always betray itself. It shows up in tension, in over-planning, in the obsession with outcomes. True control isn't obsessed with results. It's rooted in direction, knowing why you act, not just how. Buddha sat beneath the shade. Control, at its core, is not about denying the world. It's about choosing your response to it, and most of all, choosing your response to yourself. Every time you feel something dark rising, anger, envy, self-doubt, you have two options. You either react from it or respond to it. The first creates karma. The second creates clarity. Most people never stop to ask, is this me, or is this my past trying to protect itself again? And so they live on repeat, believing they're choosing freely when really they're just reenacting old pain. Control, Buddha said, is being able to see that pattern without shame and choosing not to repeat it. That requires awareness deeper than impulse. It requires presence deeper than thought. And it requires self-honesty sharp enough to cut through every lie you've been telling yourself about why you're still stuck. The man looked at the sky. But what if I've never known that kind of control? Buddha answered, then today is the beginning. You don't need a full map, just a first step, and the courage to say, I'm done living on default. This is the moment people miss. The quiet shift when control stops being a punishment and becomes a choice. When you stop asking how to feel better and start asking how to live true. That's when control stops being external and becomes sacred. Not about fixing yourself, but about holding yourself steady, especially when everything else pulls you in 10 directions. Buddha looked at him closely. You don't need to control everything, just enough to stop betraying yourself, just enough to stop abandoning your own path. That's where life begins to respond. Not when you wait, but when you start showing up like someone who finally remembers who they are. By the 6th day, the man's eyes had changed. He no longer looked lost. He looked alert. Something inside him had started to wake up. Not comfort, not peace, but clarity. The kind of clarity that stings before it heals. As they walked through the forest, Buddha spoke. Most people wait for change to happen from outside. They wait for signs, for timing, for someone to push them. But responsibility means no more waiting. It means you are the sign. You are the turning point. That is the true function of control, not as a leash, but as ignition. When you take full responsibility for your life, you stop blaming the past, your parents, the system, your partner, the world. Not because they had no impact, but because impact and authorship are not the same. What shaped you is not what must define you. Most people confuse pain with identity. They think being wounded gives them permission to stay passive. But pain is not permission. It's an invitation to rebuild, to choose again. Buddha stopped by a stream. The water flows forward because of its nature, he said. But your nature includes choice. That is your advantage and your burden. The man asked, then what is the cost of avoiding responsibility? Buddha answered without hesitation. Your potential, that is always the price. When you avoid responsibility, you give your power to everything but yourself. You hand over the pen, and let the world write your story, and then wonder why it doesn't feel like your life. Control brings weight, it brings discomfort, but it also brings momentum. The moment you start choosing, even small choices, from alignment instead of avoidance, life starts shifting. Not magically, not instantly, but undeniably. Responsibility rewires your nervous system. It tells your brain, I am no longer a victim of my own patterns. That message changes everything. The man asked, and if I make mistakes? Buddha smiled. Then you learn, because a mistake made from presence is better than perfection made from fear. Control is not about never falling. It's about knowing why you got up. People who refuse control often claim freedom, but true freedom is not the absence of responsibility. It is the expression of it. And only those who own their choices can shape their future. The rest just inherited by default. Buddha placed a hand on the man's shoulder. You are not here to live someone else's script. You are here to author your own, not to control everything, but to stop surrendering to things that don't serve you. That is what full responsibility feels like. Not pressure, power. On the seventh day, they returned to where it all began. Same path, same silence. But the man was not the same. He walked differently. Not faster, not louder, but grounded. He didn't speak, and he didn't need to. Buddha could feel it. The shift had happened. But one thing remained: integration. Understanding not just why control matters, but how to live it without becoming a prisoner of it. They sat beneath the same tree. The sun filtered through the branches like it did that first morning. Buddha spoke. Control is not everything, but without it, everything falls apart. The purpose of control is not to eliminate chaos, but to contain it, not to prevent emotion, but to guide it. Real control doesn't mean ruling yourself with an iron hand. It means building an inner structure strong enough to hold who you are, even on the worst days. He looked at the man. The mistake people make is thinking control must be total, but too much control becomes suppression. Too little becomes collapse. Your task is not to master control in every moment. Your task is to recognize when you're drifting too far from yourself and gently return. Then, Buddha gave him what he called the 4 gates of wise control. First, he said, you must choose what you allow into your mind. Every thought is a seed. What you water grows. Control begins with attention, not force, attention. Second, he continued, choose your response before your emotion chooses it for you. Pause, breathe, then act. That gap between feeling and action is your power. Third, he said, hold yourself accountable. Every day, ask, did I move closer to my truth or further away? Not as judgment, as orientation. And fourth, Buddha concluded, know when to release. Control is not rigidity, it's rhythm. Know when to hold and when to let go. That is wisdom. The man listened with his whole body. These weren't ideas anymore. They were tools, real, practical, immediate. Use control today, Buddha said, by choosing one thing you will do with full presence. Not perfectly, just deliberately. Choose what you eat, how you speak, when you rest. Choose even if it's small, because every small act of conscious control rebuilds your strength. And if I go too far, the man asked. Then you'll feel it, Buddha replied. You'll become rigid, harsh. You'll forget softness. That's your signal to return. Real control never requires you to abandon yourself, only to remember yourself. The man stood, taller than before, not because someone fixed him, but because someone finally showed him how to hold his own weight. If these words speak to you, subscribe to this channel. Let the algorithm bring this truth to those who are ready to stop drifting. And join the Telegram. That's where the deeper conversations happen. If you're done running, write in the comments, "I no longer run from my pain." Let's see how many of us are ready to take back the wheel.